Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to a very special edition of our series called Conservationists in Action, because for the first time we have somebody that will recognize where that phrase came from. Actually, we borrowed it from Rachel Carson, and we've been using it for the last 10 years or so to describe this show. And hopefully we're not plagiarizing. We think of it more as an homage.
It is an homage. Have you told your viewers that it's a series that Rachel, of pamphlets that she did for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife
We expect you to do that later in the interview.
I will. I'd be happy to. It's great to be here,
Let me introduce you first.
Thank you. Great, sure.
Bob and I have known each other for a couple of years, and it's really a pleasure to finally get him out here to NCTC. And let me just give you a little of his very interesting background. Bob is a senior fellow at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies and author, very interesting book called Hope for a Heated Planet, How Americans Are Fighting Global Warming and Building a Better Future. Indeed, we hope they are. He's also the former CEO of the Nobel Peace Prize winning Physicians for Social Responsibility and an award-winning journalist, and most importantly for his newest book, which we're going to talk about today. Okay. He is currently the president of the Rachel Carson Council. And his very recent book came out about, what, a year and a half ago, perhaps?
Just over a year.
Just over a year?
Maybe a year and a quarter, something like that. It's coming out in paperback. But buy the hardback first.
His newest book, and a great read, is called Rachel Carson and Her Sisters. I have to look at the subtitle, Extraordinary Women Who've Shaped America's Environment. It's a wonderful, beautiful examination of American women conservationists from, the mid-19th century up through the present. And
I knew them all.
We don't go back that far. Yeah. But Bob, it's really a pleasure to have you here. And since you alluded to it already, why don't you tell us where conservation and action comes from?
Well, you know, and most people don't realize that Rachel Carson, if they know Rachel Carson, and part of the reason that the Rachel Carson Council exists is to promote her legacy as well as the kind of environmental action she was known for, Silent Spring in particular, about pesticides and DDT. But few people think, Rachel Carson, oh yes, she's the famous Fish and Wildlife Service person.
That's how we think of her.
I do too, and almost approximately 15 years in the federal government, where she wrote about these things. She first was hired to do radio scripts. Here we are doing the same thing, only television. And the Conservation and Action series was one that went to various refuges around the country. And Rachel was a meticulous researcher, obsessive almost, maybe. So she read everything about these places, who had been there, what went on, the science, before she ever went. And then after she did that, she wrote these wonderful government brochures, pamphlets, I guess would be a better, booklets would be a better term, about each of them. And in the book, which I will relentlessly talk about throughout, our interview, there's some interesting connections to some of the women who came before and after her. A quick example, Terry Tempest Williams is a contemporary naturalist, author, and she writes her first and probably still best known award-winning book, Refuge, An Unnatural History of Time and Place, is at the Bear River Refuge outside Salt Lake. And Terry writes basically about how it was a refuge for her, but it's gone underwater and flooding. It's also a metaphor that parts of her family are dying from breast cancer, that only later we learn as the whole family has been exposed to open-air nuclear testing coming downwind from Nevada, as we say in the East, Nevada out there. But Rachel Carson did a wonderful study and booklet on the Bear River Refuge. And Terry Tempest Williams considers herself a devotee, that Rachel is one of her heroes. And so there's a direct line, sometimes indirect, but I tried to show in the book that there are a number of myths about Rachel Carson. A lot of it sort of happened inadvertently, that she alone, with one great book, started the modern environmental movement. And I spent a lot of time, probably too much time, saying, well, that just isn't the case. She was not alone, and I talk about the women around her. And she had a whole series of predecessors going back to 1850, a number of whom she knew about or would have read, that her mother was an educated woman who taught her about nature. Right. And so that's sort of the general idea about the book, is that no person, however great, Rachel Carson or anyone else, creates a movement, creates social change, fixes our environment simply by writing a book. I know I haven't.
That's a good start, though.
That's sort of the premise.
Right. Well, and as your answer to this first question showed, you've got a broad swath of knowledge on Carson, women conservationists, and as we can talk about a little later, toxins and so on. So I'd like to remind folks, if anybody out there has a question, please do type it into the chat room window on the lower right-hand side, and Bob will be happy to answer all of your questions while I sit silently and wonder.
Well, if I don't know the answer, you will chime in, I hope,
I'll
Mark.
make one up for you.
Yeah.
One of the earliest people you talk about actually has another fish and wildlife connection. That's Florence Miriam Bailey. Tell us a little about her. She's one of our heroes out here.
Well, fortunately, your viewers may not know that I will be speaking and giving a talk, and Florence Miriam Bailey plays a large part.
Oh, great.
Now, who in the world is she? The short version, such as it is that Florence was the younger sister of a very well-known naturalist and writer and head of the U.S. Biological Survey that later was absorbed into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service thanks to Harold Ickes and some New Deal stuff. And she grew up in upstate New York in a mansion-like setting out in the woods. Her dad, Clinton Merriam, had been a merchant in New York, retired early, having made a fortune in New York at age 40. He was also a congressman. And so he introduced his older son, Hart, to all of the establishment in Washington, the heads of the Smithsonian and all these sorts of things. So the older son wrote his first book when he was, I think, 17 or so, about the birds of Connecticut. And in those days, we looked at birds primarily by shooting them. Oh, there's a rose-breasted grosbeak. And then stuffed them. So in upstate New York, little young Hart and his younger sister Florence were living on this estate-like place, and wealthy dad built a 3-story building for young Hart to house the shot and stuffed animals, birds, etc. He was such a leading naturalist, and his books started in right away, that he was admired by Teddy Roosevelt, the iconic conservationist president who wanted to grow up, he said, to be like Hart Merriam.
Did not know
and so Florence, meanwhile, watching her brother, who she had idolized and adored, shoot, kill, and stuff 3 stories worth of animals and birds, was horrified. Just like, oh my God, she couldn't do it, she didn't like it, she didn't believe in it. And so when she was young, she started in attracting the birds, hold seed in her hand, and come look at them live. And because of that background, and because she was connected to Hart and all of the Washington establishment, she went off to Smith College, and she became the nation's first college campus environmental organizer. She started an Audubon Society chapter, one of the first ones on campus. She brought in the great nature writer John Burroughs. She had 75 Smithies trek through the rain to look at birds with burros. And she started this chapter, and she wrote her senior thesis, in effect, on the slaughter in the millinery trade. At those days, up to 5 million birds, herons, egrets, were killed and put on women's hats, as were entire birds. So from there, she went to Audubon. She wrote for them. She ultimately came to Washington and married Teddy Roosevelt's main tracker and field guy, one Vernon Bailey, who was involved in doing U.S. Biological Survey all over the country about the mammals, or trying to show there were endangered stuff, that the Indians should have woods around where they live so it wouldn't screw things up. So there's Florence, brilliant writer. She goes out west with Vernon, her husband, and writes a number of things on the West. including birding on a bronco. But she collects her first series of essays for Audubon and bird lore and so on into a book called Birding Through an Opera Glass. Yes. And so, on the cover of the book, when I occasionally talk about it, I say, well, you know,
yeah.
Rachel Carson wasn't alone on the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
She's using binoculars because Florence Marion Bailey set off the trend of observing birds in the field live. She then wrote the first Western Field Guide. She won medals for writing The Birds of New Mexico. She and her brother and others were part of the D.C. Audubon Club that became the Audubon Naturalist Society, and were all part of the initial efforts to head toward what became the Migratory Bird Act. But in the case of, Florence, wrote in 1938 or 9 a government booklet on the Grand Canyon, yeah, which I have with me and will wave around at the live speech we're doing later.
Great.
So the connection to Rachel Carson, to me, is very interesting, is that later Rachel Carson serves on the board of the Audubon Naturalist Society, as did Florence Marion. They overlap by a few years. By this time, Florence is in her late 80s, grande dame. She wrote for magazines that we know Rachel Carson read in her youth. And because Rachel did so much research on all of the places she visited out west, I don't have any document that says Rachel Carson admired Florence Marion Bailey. But I'm sure that she did and was influenced, and underneath the two of them is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That these women who are brilliant interpreters, writers, teachers, public figures, depend upon the science and the surveys and the work done by government scientists. And they are the ones that transmute it to the public and help build the movements and the Audubon stuff and environmentalism that we have. So she is, as an aside, a little bit, it happens that the Rachel Carson Council that I run is an environmental group that Rachel Carson envisioned. She wanted to have something carry on her legacy. Folks may recall that she was dying of breast cancer when she was writing Silent Spring, and so she wanted this group to go on. Her close friend and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service buddy, Shirley Briggs, took this photo. Again, I say Rachel Carson was not alone. It's not just the great woman theory of history. And Shirley helped with a few others to found the Rachel Carson Council and carried on her work on pesticides and the like. I happen to be the first male to run the council since Rachel Carson's day. It's sort of intimidating, but I try to do it.
Well, you're opening up new doors.
So that's Florence Marion Bailey, and she is just, I wish I knew her, but one of my board members at the council, actually it's a couple, and Lee Talbot is his name, but it's Lee Miriam Talbot. And his grandfather is Hart Marion.
Wow.
His great aunt is Florence. And when I go to their house, there are pictures and paintings and drawings by Florence, not just writing, on the walls, as well as stuff from Hart and collections of these things from right back then. So sorry for the long answer, Mark,
yeah, that was a great one.
See,
Hart Miriam's one of our heroes. Shirley Briggs, who you brought up. Yeah. We did an oral history with her. We met her when she was still alive, and just as Carson was actually the first female scientist we hired, Shirley was one of the earliest, if not the first, female illustrator we hired. We'd had Bob Hines on staff, and I can't recall when Kay Howe, if she came before or after Shirley, but it was...
I believe she brought Shirley along with her.
So she came previous to her. So,
from Iowa.
So we had quite a power pack. We had 3 women that were doing very effective communication for conservation.
And that's what it takes. I mean, that's part of the implicit theme of the book is, and a number of these women in the book were not at the absolute peak of power, prestige. Right. The older ones couldn't finish their PhD. They weren't allowed because they were women, and they got fired and passed over, or they had all of these stories. From my point of view, though I don't wish, sort of gender bias on anybody, it allowed them to ask fresh questions. They weren't the defenders of the status quo, of the science, of anything. They could take a fresh look, a creative look and ask new questions. One of the women in my book who's just died last year, Theo Colborne, who I knew and worked and was very close to, she was an amateur naturalist ornithologist, a bird watcher, and did stuff for Audubon. When she graduated in pharmacy from Rutgers in 1947, married a pharmacist, a guy who had 3 drugstores in New Jersey. They ultimately moved to Colorado to get a better lifestyle. He had a little chain of drugstores and a sheep farm. And Theo Colborne was the good wife who had 4 children, helped with the sheep farm and the drugstores. And when he died, she started a PhD in zoology at Wisconsin. Yeah, I think so, sorry. And finished up and came to Washington with a brand new minted PhD at age 60 approximately when I met her. And so I like to say, particularly on campuses when I'm invited to speak to the young women there who will be future leaders, but your career may take different paths, or you may still run into obstacles. Let's not kid ourselves that we're entirely gender neutral these days. However, I want you to think about women like Theo Colborne, who went through all of that, and her best work was from 60 to nearly 90. Yeah. And she is the one, among other books, wrote Our Stolen Future, that brought endocrine disruption, the scientific notion that just tiny exposures of toxic chemicals could, if the timing were bad in utero, could affect gender development, a whole lot of behavioral issues. They poo-pooed her at first, just like Rachel Carson. Hysterical woman. Yeah. What kind of science is that? A late PhD. For any of you young women or older women, you can start in at age 60, get that PhD, and come on out to the National Training Center and go for it. So,
no, Colburns Extraordinary. She came out here in 2003. She must have been late 70s or even 80s by then. Best-selling book, Our Stolen Future, really, an heir to Carson, and the nicest person in the world. One of the things that came across, we were able to interview Shirley, an early research assistant for Carson, a biologist, Chan Robbins, who worked under her. And one of the things that comes out about Carson, too, she was an incredibly kind person, which you can't necessarily get from a book like Silent Spring. I don't think you know what the personality is, so I think that's important. You've mentioned Florence Miriam Bailey and kind of made us rethink about where field guides came from with her pioneering book, Looking at Birds Through an Opera Glass, which I like. Your book also does an interesting job of suggesting the discovery of pollution predates Barry Commoner, which is where I thought it began in the 60s with Alice Hamilton and Ellen Swallow Richards. Tell us a little about these
early. Well, I should say, first of all, that Rachel knew and corresponded with Barry Commoner.
I did not know that.
And that has to do, we'll come back to her anti-nuclear side.
Okay.
But in the world of chemicals and toxins and so on, one of the great things about Rachel Carson that is important to me, I happen to have training or education, and I've worked in both the humanities and the sciences, environmental health, public health, and English and American studies, oddly enough. And combining them is absolutely critical. And then as I been in the big sort of national environmental movement, at least organizations in Washington, there isn't enough cooperation, coordination between environment, meaning that stuff out there, nature. There's the birds, the bunnies, the orcas, the polar bears struggling on the ice. People? Well. And then there's environmental health, environmental and occupational medicine. They care deeply if there's, you're going to get breast cancer from drinking the wrong water. Right. Putting them together has proved difficult. And so what has attracted me and inspired me about Rachel Carson so much is that Silent Spring, some people, they don't remember it well. Or they say, didn't she write about the birds?
Right.
And I'll say, yes, she did. But much of the book is about exposures from these pesticides and the development of cancer. Right. This is an environmental health human book. It affects, and she talks about it, affects the fish, the ecosystems, people. It is integrated. It is one thing. And so that's, what I really admire about her. So she is one of the great environmental health figures, but she has predecessors that I do talk about in the book. And these women
Poorly
are,
remembered today.
oh, if they're, so the first one I think that you were alluding to, Ellen Swallow Richards.
Yes.
I wish she were a bird watcher because Ellen Swallow was her maiden name, but
Like George Bird Grinnell.
yeah, yes, exactly. So Ellen Swallow Richards, if you don't know her, and if you're, quickly start Googling or actually get Rachel Carson and Her Sisters, is an easier way to do this. In there, she was a brilliant woman who was essentially, like a lot of these women in the 19th century, homeschooled by mothers who had great educations but weren't allowed to have a professional career, etc. She showed signs of math and science genius at an early age. Vassar College has just opened for women. Keep in mind that women didn't have college educations. They weren't allowed. Right. So she goes to Vassar and she studies with a great, incredibly well-known and unusual woman astronomer named Maria Mitchell.
Oh, yeah.
Brass telescope, discovering comets and all this sort of thing. So she's teaching at Vassar. Ellen Swallow Richards studies with her, is her brilliant protege. She earns a BA and an MA. She's a returning student who's worked in business, who's helped her father's business with artificial stone and developing new kinds of stone. And so picture 26 or 7-year-old Ellen Swallow Richards, a math and science genius, shows up in your class and is doing astronomy. She has recommendations from Ellen Swallow Richards and other noted people at Vassar at the time. But she didn't want to be an astronomer. She thought it was too ethereal, looking at the skies, thinking about the cosmos. She said, I want to be of use. I want to be practical. I want to help people. So I'm going to do chemistry. Where does a woman in 1873 get a first-class education in chemistry? Not. She hears through friends that a place is opened down the road from Harvard which will not teach applied sciences. It's beneath them.
Right.
So there's this little technical institute has opened down the way that becomes MIT. And being frankly bright and bold, Ellen applies. She waits and waits and waits, and she finally gets a letter from the president of MIT. She's all excited and says, you have been accepted to MIT. First woman. Only when she arrives does she realize that she has no status. She's not paying tuition. She's in effect an auditor who also has a part-time job helping the one woman on campus who cleans up the equipment in the chemistry lab. And this is Ellen Swallow Richards. The trustees have debated for over a month on whether to admit her. A couple of people have spoken for her. She's in on probation. Despite all that, she becomes their leading scientist. She works with the great chemists at MIT and begins water quality studies in the state of Massachusetts, where she personally does, and there's a picture in the book, it's too hard to show, of her in Victorian costume with some guy in a bowler hat by a stream in Massachusetts. She took 40,000 water samples and personally looked at them under the microscope and examined them for toxin. She drew these gorgeous maps of where pollution was coming. They're called chlorine maps. Excuse me. And so she then works to get legislation. And so Ellen Swallow Richards, write down the three names, is the mother of water quality, environmental regulation in the country. And more than that, she founded many other disciplines, including engineering. It's too hard to go through. She started the AAUW. She advocated for women's education. She tried to reform the schools in Boston, many wonderful things. So that's, and there's some interesting connections between Ellen and the world that Rachel Carson was growing up in. But these women got forgotten because as science was becoming more professionalized, and after we developed the germ theory of disease, thanks to Pasteur and all these others, They needed bacteriology. And they kept hiring men who had been freshly minted and passing over Ellen Swallow Richards.
Yeah.
And so she ended up essentially a public figure who lectured around the country, who won prizes for her work at all of the great expositions, the World's Fairs, the Columbian Exhibition, and so on. But as far as tenured positions and academic laurels, no. And then she founded what was called the Home Economics Association. In my day, you can see that I go back to when home education in high school was the boys took shop and we tinkered and made walnut salad bowls and little electric motors and God knows what. And the women went down the hall and did brownies and baked stuff. That is a denigration and a corruption of what Ellen Swallow Richards had started. That's a post-World War II where women are sort of pushed out of the way again so men can take their place.
Right.
And so she started what in effect would be consumer movements, popular citizen science movements, where she sent microscopes and materials around the country so women in their homes could look for adulterated food, learn the science, and become a giant consumer and health movement. That's what she meant by home economics, but only later. So if you Google her, you may see that, she's the woman who started home economics. And, I don't know.
That's something different.
Fabulous. That's Ellen Swallow Richards. I just can't say enough about her.
Well, the middle part of your book is all about Carson.
Oh, yes.
So the obvious question is, why write another book about Carson? What type of take did you have on Carson?
I'm seriously glad you asked that, Mark, because I should stress this is not a biography of Rachel Carson. There, of course, is a great one by Linda Lear, the authoritative, definitive one. There are newer ones that have a few new angles, Bill Sauter, and there's a nice little one by Mark Lytle.
Yep.
If you want to carry around a small paperback, Mark Lytle, gentle, subversive. So it didn't need a biography. What I wanted to do was reintroduce Rachel, but in a fuller context. And that is, as I've alluded to a little bit, because I am trained in both literature and public health. I went to Johns Hopkins, as did Carson. I was an English major originally, as was Rachel Carson. So I had certain affinities. I also have led national environmental groups and lobbied and advocated and done organizing, as did Carson. And I wanted people to say, look, this is not just some literary figure who wrote a book, as I've said, I think, that started a movement. First of all, let's talk about her being political. For those of you who are not political, cover your ears. Rachel Carson was a dedicated political person. She believed strongly, given all of her time in Washington, with the federal government, with all her friends inside and outside of government, of the importance of changing policy, that it's all well and good to go birding, to collect butterflies, to admire nature, to write about it, to educate about it. But it finally needs some political stuff. So quickly with Rachel Carson, she was an admirer of Adlai Stevenson, who lost, this is so obscure, any undergraduates, forgive me, Adlai Stevenson ran against Dwight Eisenhower. He was before Lincoln. No, I think. But that was because he was concerned about open-air nuclear testing, about the environment in ways that Eisenhower actually rolled back some of the environmental progress that had happened in the New Deal under FDR and Harold Ickes and others. And so that's why she was for Adlai Stevenson. And of course, he lost. Did she give up? No. She kept doing these things, tackling the corporations that were polluting and producing these chemicals, but also she ended up testifying before the Congress. Through friends of hers, she met the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, a noted environmentalist, worked with his chief of staff, and worked directly with Women for John F. Kennedy. She joined the President Kennedy's task force. In fact, it's so wonderful. I wish this would happen to me. When Silent Spring came out, Kennedy's at a press conference, and the reporters are doing the reporting. Mr. President, Yes. He says, so we've been hearing a lot about pesticides. What are you going to be doing about that? And he says, oh, why, yes, you're referring to Miss Carson's book, and we'll be looking into that, and I'm starting a task force on that. I thought, can you imagine the sales if John F. Kennedy says, oh, yes, I know Rachel Carson's book. But behind the scenes, she is working, and she had already been working, writing speeches for politicos, for legislators, working on these task forces, and deeply involved in policy. So that's one piece, I think, that people should know. The other piece that we've alluded to a little bit is that she's not alone. She had a powerful network of women supporters, friends, and colleagues. We talked a little bit about Shirley Briggs, who started the Rachel Carson Council, where I'm carrying on, and she took the photo on the cover of the book. But there are others. For example, part of the launch of a new book is to have a big book opening, sign, sell, have the press if it's a fairly big book. And through all of these contacts that I've been mentioning, the fairly conservative publishers of Silent Spring, Houghton Mifflin up in Boston, did not really want a Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill launch. Too political. This is a nature and pollution book, but politics? Mm-mm. Well, it happens that one of these women close to Rachel is named Marie Rodell. Fascinating woman. The short version of Marie is that she was Rachel's literary agent. They were very close. She counseled her on publicity, on politics, on all sorts of things. But what people, I think, don't realize is that Marie Rodell was a very progressive person, as was Rachel Carson. So this is partly a history book, so this is a history lesson. Marie Rodell was the literary agent for one Helen Gahagan Douglas. Now, younger viewers will be going, and that would be who? More mature viewers will say, was she the... Yes, the Pink Lady. Yeah. Richard Milhous Nixon ran for the Senate in 1948. His opponent was a gorgeous movie star married to Melvyn Douglas, who was quite educated and progressive herself. And in looking like he might lose, old Tricky Dick, later President Nixon, accused her of having... She's the Pink Lady, is no different than the record of that Vito Marcantonio, who was a very progressive left-wing congressman. This was all communist red-baiting smears. Not true, but Marie Rodell is handling Helen Gahagan Douglas. Even more interestingly to me is that while she's working with Rachel Carson, she is the literary agent for the first book of a young Baptist preacher, whose book, you may or may not recall, was called Stride Toward Freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. She was the literary agent while she was working with Rachel Carson. For folks who haven't followed all of that history, if you've looked at new documentaries, you know that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were trying to smear King, claim he was a communist. They forced two progressives off his staff, Bayard Rustin, who was not a communist, he was a pacifist and gay organizer. They forced him to push him out, or they would reveal every personal secret, tried to get him to commit suicide. I'm not sure, but I think it's one of the possibilities of why Rachel Carson has an FBI file. Yeah. It's short, it's redacted, that means there are black strips on it. You can't see...
We have a copy of it, you can't read it.
Who she met and why this is. So that's sort of the interesting progressive background of Marie Rodell, but she's one of these women that Rachel's not alone. She wants to hold a Washington launch, so she holds a power luncheon, women only, as... Eleanor Roosevelt had press conferences that were for women only, and she was like a leading, feminist of the time. So Marie, with some others, helps round up a luncheon, and first they've invited the publisher of the Washington Post, Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member for FDR, Secretary of Labor, the heads of national organizations and Federation of Women's Clubs, the AAUW. You have to think big power lunch. And they help create the launch for Rachel Carson. They connect her up further to other organizations that invite her to speak, that buy copies, etc. And this is all happening essentially against the wishes of the publishers. Like, we can't give you extra copies, we don't want to do that. And throughout, Marie Rodell is essential to that. There's one other woman I should mention I just think is great, who's in here. This is Rachel's Not Alone. Yeah. Marjorie Spock.
Yes.
It's one of my favorite characters.
Dr. Benjamin.
Yes. Now again, let's pretend we're in the auditorium here with our listeners on some college campus, and I'll say, Marjorie Spock. And some people go, Mr. Spock? Did she have pointed ears? Yeah. No, not that. And then the older ones will say, Dr. Spock? So yes. Dr. Benjamin Spock was a leading pediatrician and baby doctor who came out against the Vietnam War and against the draft. Again, they tried to convince that he was a conspirator. He faced possible prison, all for saying he wanted to support young men who were refusing the draft during Vietnam. His sister, Marjorie, they're both from a wealthy family, attorneys for the Harrimans and the railroad interests. They've got money. So Marjorie was allowed to be a little eccentric. And instead of going to Smith or as a woman of her class, she went off to Europe. She studied eurythmy. She studied with folks who had very advanced thinking over in Europe, came back, and was teaching at a Waldorf school on Long Island, actually in the town where I grew up, Garden City. She had what should we say, an advanced lifestyle. She had a lifetime committed partner, a woman named Polly Richards, who was even wealthier. And so they had an estate, in effect, on North Shore, Long Island, with many acres of organic gardens, because they were organic gardeners, vegans, teaching at progressive schools, right. And all during the time that led up to Silent Spring, when the government is spraying DDT everywhere. The planes come across North Shore, Long Island, and across the many acres of organic gardens down below that belong to Marjorie Spock. Big mistake, as they say in Pretty Woman. In fact, I say to people, and this is true, if you are going to pollute and dump chemicals and ruin stuff like that, never pick on rich people. Go find some place in Louisiana where no one's going to care, there's no political representation. Marjorie Spock organized all her wealthy neighbors, Robert Cushman Murphy, a noted ornithologist. This all led to broadly speaking, to the first lawsuit against DDT. And it's that precedes Rachel writing this. And so the opportunity is there because there's now already brouhaha and lawsuits and information being disclosed. And so Marjorie Spock sat in her estate-like place with an ancient thermofax machine in the basement, which evidently, this is even before me, Mark, it's this stinky thing that does one page at a time. But she was like the grassroots network and email listserv friend of Rachel Carson, feeding her studies, legal materials, introducing her to people all over the country. Rachel had her own networks.
Yeah.
So again, a book that changes the world and builds an environmental movement doesn't come from just the pen of one great woman. There are organizers, in this case a woman who took on the whole federal government and sued, gathered in the leading people of the time in the New York area, and helped kick off what became a very determined effort to get rid of DDT. It wasn't just Silent Spring. That brought it to broader reading audiences and so on through the New Yorker. So that's part of Rachel Carson. We talked a little bit about her predecessors, that she wasn't alone. But I should say for Silent Spring, it's a wonderful book. People forget that it begins with a fable.
Yep.
I'm an old English major. And they ridiculed Rachel for lots of reasons, that she was unmarried. I tried to explain to newer audiences that the worst slur perhaps used against her was not even necessarily communist, but spinster.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one guy said, one of her opponents says, "How can a woman without children tell us about the future?" I mean, it was so retrograde.
And she adopted her grandnephew
yes,
by that
yes,
point?
that's right. So, but it opens with this fable of an empty town. And that's what many people remember, that no birds sing, a line from Keats, Silent Spring, that it's eerie, it's memorable, it's visual, it's powerful. It's not just, as she goes on to do, well footnoted, the effects on the body and environmental health, etc. So she was an unusual talent to combine the science, the writing, to network with federal scientists, Fish and Wildlife, and other agencies, to have a wonderfully eclectic set of friends, from unusual lifestyles like Marjorie Spock through very establishment characters. She brought them all together, and that's part of the strength of Rachel Carson, and it comes through in her writing, and it's what I try to do, and with my colleagues and others at the Rachel Carson Council, is to bring together the whole environment movement. So it's not just polar bears. I am going to mention this a little bit tonight, but there are a couple of other issues that people may not associate with Rachel Carson.
Yeah.
One of which is global climate change. Now, she did write about the effect of the oceans on climate and the sea around us.
Yep.
A number of times she writes about it, but she was aware of early studies that went to the Kennedy administration about global climate change. In terms of exactly what she looked at and when, it's a little hard to document that on April 2nd she opened this pamphlet. But she was long friends with a guy named Roger Reilly, a leading scientist, oceanographer, back to World War II days, and he was commissioned to do studies from U.S. atomic bomb blast tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in 1946, Operation Crossroads. We tethered a bunch of old surplus Navy ships, blew up one atomic bomb from under the water, dropped another one from a B-29, and of course, as usual with tests, they've got plants and animals and stuff all over to see what will happen, to trace the radiation, and Reilly is in charge of all of this, and Rachel Carson reads and edits, is in touch with him, and so as early as 1946, she is horrified by this and turns against open-air nuclear testing, which she kept up until the Kennedy administration, since he obviously was the one who ended open-air testing. Another reason she liked Kennedy. But along the way, Roger Reilly, who also invited Rachel to come to the Marshall Islands, she couldn't for a lot of the usual family and other reasons. He got a government grant, and I am going to say this about the government, all these scientific agents. He got a grant to study carbon concentration in the atmosphere, and had built a facility in Hawaii with a guy named Charles Keeling, that were the first measurements of CO2 and its concentrations going up and up. And so he quickly, they were afraid their grants would run out, so he wrote some pamphlets, he wrote and talked to the government. They put on a conference that Keeling and other experts were involved in. They put out a booklet through the Conservation Federation about early warnings about CO2. The numbers have barely changed. All they had seen was that from like 308 parts per million, or maybe from 306 to 310, it was going up.
Yeah.
Rachel Carson would have been aware of all of that. And given her concerns and her ecological view of things, I argue, and when I speak, that at the Rachel Carson Council, we are carrying forward her legacy and worrying about global climate change. And the women in the back of the book who continue her legacy, Sandra Steingraber is a wonderful author who's in here, who's currently leading efforts nationwide against fracking, not only because it does air and water pollution around the sites or causes earthquakes in Texas and Oklahoma, et cetera, but because it's natural gas that gets burned and causes climate change. And so that's pretty much why, to this day, Rachel Carson is central to what we as conservationists, naturalists, environmentalists, activists do. And I hope in looking at the book, people will remember there is a role for all of us. There are organizers and writers and photographers and filmmakers and TV studios This is all a part of one big movement. People have different gifts, and they build on the work of others, and others will go on. And so that's what I try to do when I speak to people, whether on television or live. I joke about playing the organ. I'm going to ask you to come on up front and commit your lives, because these are the issues that threaten all life, the whole planet, the polar bears and the people. And we can do something about it. That's what the first book you mentioned, Hope for a Heated Planet. You don't have to be a climate scientist. You need to know enough science to understand and not get bamboozled.
Right.
But you can be teaching, writing, or just a citizen who decides to join a march or talk to your congressman. It's essential, and we have some wonderful, wonderful role models for women and for men about how to do this. So that's what the book is about, and I'm just always happy to talk at length about it.
Well, Carson's the pivot point in the book, right? You've got
Yeah.
women conservationists before and after. So I think it raises the question, what is her most important legacy? And it's cruel to narrow it down to one or two things, but people have talked about the literary legacy, women in science, children in nature. There's a whole slew.
Yeah, that's too hard a question, Mark. Not a question
Not
mark.
for the
question,
president,
comma,
not
Mark.
for the president of the Rachel Carson Council.
I think it is what I would broadly call her environmental ethic. She was an admirer of Albert Schweitzer, the great humanitarian doctor, who spoke out against nuclear weapons and therefore was surveilled by the CIA and the FBI at his clinic in Lambaréné in Gabon. But she shared his reverence for life. She believed deeply that everything was interconnected, that everything we do affects everything else, and importantly, that we have a responsibility to do something. I used to run a group you mentioned called Physicians for Social Responsibility. It is not enough even to have a brilliant understanding of ecology and how if you throw your trash here, it's going to affect somebody in Iceland. You have to do something about it. Rachel was raised in a pretty strict Presbyterian family. She did not remain a Presbyterian, but her background led her to, frankly, a sense of responsibility, a duty, that if you knew these things, if you understood and loved and cared about them and how they were connected, you would have to act. So for me, the real legacy is not even just Silent Spring or her wonderful ocean works. It is someone who has lived out every aspect and stood up boldly. I mean, she's a little woman. I don't mean a little woman. I mean, she's small, quiet, unlike me, just almost shy, and yet took on corporations face to face in public because that was her responsibility as a person. So that, for me, I think is the real legacy of Rachel Carson and the Rachel Carson Council that we try to keep going, is that we have a responsibility to know and understand these things, to feel them deeply, to imagine what's happening, but not just to say, oh my God, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, but to do something. With each of us have some gift, speaking, writing, using the microscope, using the computer, passing out pamphlets, demonstrating. Some people love to demonstrate. Whatever that gift is, use it. And that's what I think is the legacy of Rachel Carson.
The other legacy of Rachel Carson, which you allude to in the introduction of your book, is she's still highly controversial.
Oh, yes.
Why is that, do you think?
Oh, do we have time for that? Oh, my
no,
goodness.
But we briefly.
I got reinterested in Rachel Carson in about 2007 was the 100th anniversary of her birth.
Yep.
And lo and behold, she was attacked wildly by then popular right-wing commentators, Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, and others. Rachel Carson is responsible for genocide. She has murdered and been responsible for the murder of tens of millions of Africans, and she is guilty. I thought, what in the heck are they talking about? What they mean is that because DDT was banned, first in the United States, after Rachel Carson died,
Right.
and later, not quite, but around the world, and because they say it was the only effective way to fight malaria, and because there are still millions of cases of malaria and large numbers of particularly children in sub-Saharan Africa, die every year. So Rachel writes Silent Spring, DDT gets banned, African kids die, she's guilty. The truth is I worked with many others on a treaty called the Stockholm Convention. It was originally called the POPs Treaty, Persistent Organic Pollutants. They bioaccumulate, they build up in fatty tissues, they're in your body, they stay around and cause human harm, not just to the critters. And so I led delegations of nonprofit environmental groups and experts, and we had friends and met, obviously, as Rachel would have, with people in the State Department, the negotiators, etc. And what was at issue was whether or not DDT would be banned. This treaty banned dieldrin, aldrin, heptachlor, all these horrible pesticides and herbicides. But DDT, I happened with others to write up and develop a public health emergency exemption. If you had an actual outbreak of, a serious outbreak of malaria in Africa, let's say, you were allowed to apply and get an exemption and use very targeted spray, et cetera, to break the back of the epidemic. And there was not a ban, there was a phase out. So both facts that it was banned and by her. And we also know, meanwhile, malaria had already been developing non-resistant strains.
Yes.
It was becoming less effective. This is why people were already investigating integrated pest management and lesser chemicals, pyrethroids and others. Right. So it's all concocted. I also witnessed the people attack at those international gatherings. They were representatives of the industries that were still making pesticides. There was an odd combination of left and right, who they would go over to the African delegations and say, you see those big, fat, white North American environmentalists, they care more about hawks than you. Right. And it's true that one of the big environmental groups I was working with wanted an immediate ban on DDT by a date certain. It would not have gotten through. No. And so I would meet with them, and I'd meet with the Africans, and this is all happening around there. And finally, after a lot of discussion with our big environmental friends in the U.S., convinced them, look, you are setting yourself up. You're going to fulfill every stereotype that you don't care about Africans, you care about birds only. We care about both of them. We care about the health of these kids. If you can, and then you create this language, and then it gets in the brackets, and we talk to the people in the State Department and the rest, and that's finally what went through, was a compromise. And so that's why Rachel is, occasionally you can still Google some sites. They're run by the same people who deny global climate change, who are for tobacco. There's always a few scientists and folks who are essentially in the pay of industry, if I may be blunt, who try to cast doubt on this stuff. So her science has held up remarkably well, particularly now that it's many years later, impeccable. And she was, I guess we should say, the other thing that people should remember about Rachel. She couldn't finish her PhD at Hopkins because she didn't have enough money. And she was commuting, doing 3 part-time jobs, adjunct professor, research assistant, while taking care of her family, her mother, and relatives that she was the sole support for. So she stopped and came to work in the government and with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But she was an impeccable scientist, and she just read and corresponded endlessly and queried the best scientists of the time. Is this, what's that? So that she wouldn't be attacked on her science. I mean, has a little bit of it changed, years later? Of course. But, and that's what I hope, again, that particularly undergraduates and folks out there will know enough science to take it seriously. I think I partly wrote the book because I like to tell stories. And you're an environmental historian. The stories of the history of science, the history of public, you can get through the people. Yeah. People who don't want, young people on campus who don't want to sign up immediately for advanced, pre-med organic chemistry or something, can begin to learn. And then it may pique your curiosity to know a little more. You have to know some science. And in Rachel's case, brilliant. And then she also translated it. So wonderful. So you scientists, take some English courses, take some writing, take some communications. Exactly.
Well, that's a good message to go out on, Bob.
All right, good.
We're just about out of time. Once again, we've spent a very quick and informative hour with Bob Musil, who's president of the Rachel Carson Council. His new book is Rachel Carson and Her Sisters, and it's a great way to explain the history of ecology, the discovery of pollution, industrial health, endocrine disruptors, DDT, all through autobiographical or biographical stories of great women conservationists.
Yes,
so it's a wonderful book. Please do go out and get it. And thank all of you for your time. This was a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
It was great. Thanks.